Welcome back to Detoxing the Discourse. My name is Beverley Planes. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a proud member of the Scoop First Nation. I have resided here in Nanaimo First Nation territory since I was 7 years old because I'm also a Millennial Scoop survivor. To add to that, I'm also a proud mom of 4 kids, ages 13, 16, 20, and 24. I'm a fierce catalyst for systemic change rooted in lived and living experience. I've stood on the front lines as executive secretary and board director for the Nanaimo Area Network of Drug Users, NANDU, as a peer support worker at CMHA's overdose prevention site here in town, and as the coordinator for the Nanaimo Community Action Team. I co-created the groundbreaking event Changing the Narrative alongside Serena, where my Voices from the Margins video and raw unflinching poem I'm Stigma shattered silence and reframed public understanding at the Port Theatre in May 2024. I have also taken the lead in coordinating pivotal community events, including the International Overdose Awareness Day in August 2024 in downtown Nanaimo, and the Spark event in collaboration with Island Health in the fall of 2024, both critical platforms that elevate peer voices, confront stigma head-on, and drive meaningful action in the toxic drug crisis. Today, I serve as a peer research associate with the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research at UVic. I will be co-authoring the upcoming Mixed Methods Evaluation of Safer Supply Initiatives with leading scholars Bernie Pauly and Karen Urbanowski. This report will be delivered directly to Health Canada and the general public, a pivotal step in demanding accountability and systemic transformation. I'm also a proud recent graduate of UBC's Indigenous Health Administration and Leadership Program, trained under visionary Indigenous leaders like Chris Horthiep and Lynn Pierre, equipped to design, lead, and implement culturally safe, Indigenous-led health and wellness programs. Currently, I'm founding Diamond in the Rough Studio and Art Gallery, Inc., a peer-led harm reduction-centered space where art and substance use support converge, free and accessible to all the community, embodying healing, empowerment, and reclamation. My work dismantles barriers and bridges the often ignored divide between lived expertise, cultural safety, and systemic innovation. I lead with uncompromising clarity and unwavering commitment to deliver evidence-based, peer-informed solutions that confront Nanaimo's toxic drug crisis and redefine what justice, healing, and Indigenous empowerment truly mean. This is my response to the Public Safety Committee meeting held Wednesday, June 11th, 2025 at 4 p.m., which I watched on YouTube as soon as it was posted. Speaking from the hard, unvarnished vantage point of someone who has camped on the streets because she was homeless, stolen merchandise just to survive, used drugs in public because nowhere else was safe or private, and relied on so-called low-barrier services that were anything but safe or stable. This meeting was not a strategy session. It was bureaucratic theater, a self-congratulatory performance of hollow compassion dressed in jargon and policy doublespeak that masked harm and erased lived reality. Behind every chart, every intervention, every promise of service delivery was a glaring absence of truth, accountability, and real connection to the people whose lives are on the line. This is not public safety. It is policy violence in disguise. It perpetuates trauma, deepens stigma, and drives community destruction under the false banner of care. Here are my 7 uncompromising reasons why. Number 1, you talk about us without us. The erasure of peer leadership wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate. At no point did the committee acknowledge having invited people with lived or living experience to co-design these so-called safety strategies. Not one person who actually uses these services was given the microphone to explain what saves lives, what inflicts harm, or what is truly needed on the ground. Once again, the voices of those most impacted were erased. Instead, the room was filled with city bureaucrats protecting budgets, landlords fretting over property values, service providers shielding their funding streams, and police officers enforcing rules they neither challenge nor understand. This isn't a mere gap in representation, it's a calculated strategy, a strategy that perpetuates criminalization, displacement, and the erasure of people who exist on the harshest margins of poverty, addiction, and colonial violence. You cannot solve a crisis for a community you refuse to sit beside. Excluding lived expertise is not inclusion, it is colonization rebranded as consultation. Number 2, dehumanizing language that masks root causes. Let's be blunt. The clinical jargon deployed in this meeting was sanitized cruelty. Descriptors like complex individuals, behaviors of concern, and mitigation strategies are not neutral terms. They are tools of institutional violence that strip people of their humanity. These phrases create a safe distance between policymakers and the brutal realities we endure: crushing poverty, systemic racism, forced family separation, intergenerational trauma, predatory policing, and the collapse of every safety net we were promised. When you talk about social disorder, you're describing human beings surviving in a world that has abandoned them. People use substances in public because they have nowhere private or safe to go. They carry every possession they own because there's no secure place to lock up their lives. They sleep in doorways because affordable housing is a lie. That is not a disorder. That is survival in the ruins of institutional neglect. This euphemistic language pathologizes trauma, treating it as an individual defect rather than the predictable outcome of living under oppressive systems. It shields the committee from accountability, allowing them to call for more surveillance, bans, and policing without ever having to name or address the real drivers of this crisis. By hiding behind sanitized terms, you absolve yourselves of responsibility for the very conditions your policies perpetuate. Number 3, punitive solutions that recriminalize survival. The committee's proud framing of boundaries is nothing more than a euphemism for criminalizing poverty and forcing people out of sight. Those 48-hour bans, CMP removals, and community safety officer patrols are not public safety measures. They are forced disappearances of the already invisible. Forced isolation. Banning someone from one spot where they had fragile stability, a drop-in, a warming shelter, a known outreach route, rips away their lifelines. Overnight, they lose access to food programs, harm reduction supplies, medical check-ins, and peer support. Increased overdose risk. When people are driven to unknown areas or forced to move constantly, they use alone in unfamiliar places. Alone use is the single biggest predictor of a fatal overdose. Your bans don't save sidewalks, they cost lives. Erosion of trust. Every time a person is swept off a bench or blocked from a park, the message is clear: you are not welcome here. This deepens distrust in all services, making individuals far less likely to seek help, even when they desperately need it. Chaotic displacement. Rather than addressing root causes like the lack of housing or safe consumption spaces, you scatter people across the city. This solution spreads crisis like wildfire rather than containing it. These so-called enforcement tools are structural violence masquerading as policy. They punish survival, fracture community ties, and magnify risk, all while claiming to protect public order. True safety isn't about bans and removals. It's about stable access to care, connection, and dignity. Number 4, displacement masquerading as neighborhood safety. Your own committee openly admits that people are simply being pushed from one block to another, from Victoria Road to Nickel Street to a vacant lot. This is not problem solving, it is a confession of failure. You are merely reshuffling trauma and suffering so it becomes less visible to businesses and homeowners. That is not strategy, that is cowardice disguised as management. Displacement fractures relationships, cuts community support networks, and throws people into chaos when they desperately need is consistency, access to outreach workers, harm reduction supplies, and peer support. This forced movement is itself a form of trauma, chipping away at the fragile foundation of trust that keeps people alive. Displacement does not eliminate public substance use or homelessness. It drives them underground and buries them deeper. If your definition of safety is making people invisible by pushing them out of sight, then you are protecting property and profit, not human lives. 5. Service gaps at the most vulnerable times. The committee openly acknowledges there's no supports between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m., and again from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., precisely the critical windows when people are most exposed to harm. These are not random or occasional lapses. They are daily, predictable gaps in care. Night shelters close their doors at 8 a.m., leaving people without a space to rest, recover, or access basic needs. Daytime drop-in centers and services don't open until after these hours, creating a dangerous vacuum. During these hours, people who have spent the night outside, exposed to weather, violence, and trauma, are forced to fend for themselves on the streets. Many are coming down from the relief substances provide, battling withdrawal or the crushing realities of trauma, pain, or neglect. These are the moments when overdose risk skyrockets, when vulnerability is at its peak, and when the absence of care is most lethal. These service gaps aren't minor inconveniences or logistical challenges. They are structural failures that systematically abandon people when they need support the most. Every hour without access to harm reduction, safe spaces, food, or medical attention increases the risk of overdose, violence, victimization, and death. What's worse, These vulnerable windows are completely predictable. The schedules of shelters, drop-ins, outreach teams, and harm reduction programs are known and stable, yet no coordinated effort exists to bridge these gaps with mobile outreach, peer support, safe consumption spaces, or emergency resources. This isn't a simple oversight, it's willful neglect. A system designed to keep people alive only on its terms, abandoning them when they need help most. This deliberate failure to provide continuous, low-barrier care during the most dangerous times is a death sentence for many. It erodes trust in services and deepens trauma, reinforcing the very cycles of harm the committee claims to want to end. True public safety demands consistent, 24/7 access to culturally safe, peer-led supports, no exceptions, no gaps. Anything less is a betrayal of the people you claim to serve. Over-reliance on policing and surveillance. It is horrifying and deeply revealing that this committee lauds increased CCTV cameras and RCMP bike patrols as markers of success. We are in the midst of a public health emergency, not a criminal uprising. Cameras do not save lives. Police officers do not reverse overdoses. What they do is create an atmosphere of constant surveillance, suspicion, and shame. For Indigenous and racialized people who already bear the brunt of systemic harassment, profiling, and violence at the hands of police, this surveillance is a direct threat to safety, not protection. Instead of fostering trust or connection, it drives people further underground, away from the services designed to help them. It breeds fear and distrust that make people less likely to reach out for support or carry life-saving supplies like naloxone. Surveillance does not reduce harm, it exacerbates it. When your response to poverty, trauma, and addiction is to ramp up policing and invasive monitoring, you have fundamentally misunderstood this crisis. You are treating symptoms with punishment rather than addressing root causes with compassion, care, and culturally safe peer-led supports. This obsession with policing is not about safety. It's about control and containment, perpetuating cycles of harm while claiming to protect the public. True public safety demands less policing and more peer-led, trauma-informed, culturally grounded care. Anything less is violence in disguise. 7. Cultural safety and Indigenous leadership ignored. You openly stated, on record, that 33.5% of service users are Indigenous. Then, without hesitation, you moved on as if that figure required no further action or reflection. Not a single mention of Indigenous-led healing, ceremony, elders, land-based supports, or genuine nation-to-nation partnership was made. This isn't a simple oversight. It's colonial erasure happening in real time. To recognize Indigenous overrepresentation in these systems and then exclude Indigenous solutions is to perpetuate the very systemic violence that created this crisis. You cannot claim to serve Indigenous people while simultaneously denying them cultural safety, sovereignty, or leadership. This contradiction is a betrayal of trust and the abandonment of responsibility. Indigenous knowledge, ceremony, and land-based healing are not peripheral add-ons or optional programs. They are foundational to authentic healing and wellness. Anything less is assimilation disguised as service, a continuation of harm masked as care. Until Indigenous voices, leadership, and ways of knowing are centered and resourced, your approach will remain incomplete, ineffective, and unjust. Cultural safety and Indigenous sovereignty are non-negotiable pillars of true public safety. What real public safety actually looks like from the ground. Peer-led governance. Nothing for us without us. Real safety demands that people with lived and living experience co-design strategies, shape policy, and control budgets, and are fairly compensated for their leadership. We are not just service users. We are knowledge holders, bridge builders, and architects of solutions. Without our leadership, there is no justice, no trust, and no effective change. 24/7 low barrier access to care. No gaps, no dead zones, no predictable windows where people are left exposed and vulnerable. If the system can identify the most dangerous hours, it must be designed to meet people there, without barriers, appointments, or judgment. Basic human dignity cannot operate on office hours. Continuous, unconditional access is a minimum standard. Safe supply and harm reduction on-site. Mobile overdose prevention, safe supply access where people actually live and gather, not tucked behind bureaucratic red tape or locked in elite clinics. Peer-led naloxone distribution and outreach embedded in communities. These are not radical or fringe demands. They are evidence-based, life-saving interventions that must be normalized and expanded. Dignified storage and shelter access. Secure lockers, storage bins, and stable shelter options that don't get dismantled every morning. People have the right to keep their belongings and maintain the fragile stability they have built. Stop sanitizing violent displacement as cleanup. It is dehumanizing and destabilizing, and it destroys trust and safety. culturally grounded supports. Indigenous-run healing programs, ceremonies, elders, sweat lodges, drum making, language revitalization, land-based programming. Indigenous sovereignty and cultural safety are not optional add-ons or considerations. They must be foundational pillars embedded in every aspect of public safety. Anything less is ongoing colonial violence. True public safety is rooted in trust, care, and respect. It centers lived expertise and Indigenous sovereignty. Until these demands are met, policies will continue to cause harm under the guise of protection. Final word, stop calling this public safety. What you keep calling public safety is nothing but a ruthless, cynical disguise for systemic violence. It is a strategy designed to erase poverty from public view, not to end poverty itself. It's about pushing people off sidewalks, out of parks, and out of sight, so businesses and property owners can feel comfortable. It's not about saving lives or building communities that are truly safe for everyone. The so-called safety is nothing more than a facade to manage public discomfort while ignoring the brutal realities faced by people who are homeless, addicted, or struggling with trauma. You're policing survival, criminalizing existence, and weaponizing bureaucracy to justify displacement and neglect. Every camera installed, every cop patrol, every ban or removal you celebrate is a calculated act of harm disguised as care. Real safety doesn't come from surveillance or exclusion. It comes from relationships built on trust, respect, and shared humanity. It comes from centering Indigenous sovereignty and culture, honoring lived and living expertise, and providing unconditional, compassionate support. It is not found in meetings where people who actually live this reality are either absent or silenced. You do not get to claim you are protecting the public when you are actively allowing the most vulnerable Indigenous people, racialized people, people who use drugs, people experiencing homelessness, to die for the comfort and convenience of others. That's not safety. It's state-sanctioned violence dressed up in polite language and policy reports. Until you dismantle the systems of exclusion and oppression at the core of your so-called public safety agenda, until you stop talking about us and start building with us, your vision will continue to be a cruel, hollow performance, a bureaucratic cage that locks people out of dignity, care, and life itself. This is not safety. This is harm, and it must end. So after watching the City of Nanaimo Public Safety Committee meeting on YouTube, I dug deeper into what this committee actually is and what it really stands for. Here's my unflinching, brutally honest breakdown based on their official mandate and public information as found on the City of Nanaimo website, critically framed through my lived experience and commitment to Indigenous empowerment and peer-led transformation. Committee purpose and mandate. A veil for policing and control. The committee claims to exist to maintain and enhance a safe and healthy community by advising council on public safety. But when you look beyond the empty phrase, their agenda reveals itself clearly. Policing, enforcement, and criminalizing the most marginalized. Their obsession with residential and commercial safety, public nuisance, graffiti, and vehicular crime is not about healing or justice. It's about control and displacement. Public nuisance is code for punishing unhoused people and people who use drugs. It's a weaponized term that masks systemic violence against Indigenous communities and peers. If this committee doesn't prioritize Indigenous safety and center lived expertise, is it perpetuating the very colonial violence it pretends to oppose? And really, when did safety become synonymous with disappearance? When did cleanliness and commercial comfort become more important than human life? Membership and representation, excluding the voices that matter. 11 voting members, mostly handpicked residents, with just a few city council members dominated by enforcement and emergency service backgrounds. Where are the seats for Indigenous leadership, peer advocates, and people with lived experience? Nowhere. This is structural erasure by design, not oversight. What does it mean when those most impacted by harm are excluded from the very spaces that claim to be fixing it? The committee deliberately silences the voice that could bring transformative solutions, reinforcing colonial gatekeeping that prioritizes policing expertise over community wisdom and healing. And if expertise only comes with a badge or a title, whose truths are being erased in the process? Scope and accessibility, a carceral echo chamber. Meeting every 2 months, their updates come almost exclusively from RCMP and fire rescue. Real power over budgets, enforcement, or meaningful policy change, absent. Do marginalized voices even get to speak? Or is this a performative stage where enforcement narratives drown out everything else? The meetings are not designed to be accessible or welcoming to Indigenous peoples or peer workers. What does it say when the very people facing the highest risk are made to feel like intruders in discussions about their own safety? Without embedding harm reduction and Indigenous self-determination, this committee's influence is nothing but a shallow charade. Focus and staff support, enforcement drives the agenda. The emphasis on graffiti, vandalism, and vehicular crime and public nuisance betrays a worldview rooted in punishment, not care. The committee's staff support coming from police, bylaw, and parking services make one thing crystal clear. Enforcement, not community healing, dictates this agenda. Peer-led harm reduction programs, invisible. And in a city grieving overdose deaths and housing loss, what does it reveal when the solutions that actually save lives don't even make the agenda? This erasure signals a deliberate refusal to embrace innovative, culturally safe, community-led responses that save lives and rebuild trust. Public access and transparency, a hollow facade. Yes, meetings are streamed publicly, but visibility alone isn't accessibility. These spaces remain hostile or inaccessible for Indigenous community members and peers who face systemic barriers. Public input is tokenistic, drowned out by bureaucratic jargon designed to exclude rather than include those most impacted. Who benefits from a process that speaks the language of inclusion but builds walls of exclusion? Policy impact and accountability, a cycle of harm. The committee touts advocacy for protecting vulnerable people, but protection here is policing and surveillance, more control, less care. Their recommendations lack measurable outcomes in overdose prevention, housing stability, or Indigenous wellness. Without transparency or genuine accountability, this committee perpetuates systemic violence masquerading as public safety. If the same harms continue year after year under the same banner of protection, how long do we keep pretending it's progress? Summary: the committee is part of the problem, not the solution. Safety remains defined by policing, bylaw enforcement, and nuisance removal. Tools of colonial oppression disproportionately harming Indigenous people, unhoused folks, and people who use drugs. Membership prioritizes enforcement backgrounds while excluding peer, Indigenous, and community leadership, cementing erasure and silencing. Public participation is performative, maintaining the status quo rather than amplifying lived expertise and Indigenous knowledge. Their work is rooted in carceral frameworks, rejecting transformative, peer-led, and culturally safe evidence-based solutions. And if lived experience isn't seen as credible, then whose reality are they planning for? After I looked into what the Public Safety Committee was all about, I also read their City of Nanaimo Public Safety Committee 2024 to 2026 term work plan. And this is my critique of that. Overall framing: enforcement, control, and displacement disguised as safety. This plan doubles down on policing priorities: CCTV expansion, graffiti crackdowns, and social disorder, vehicular crime, all tools of social control, not community healing. Public nuisance and social disorder remain coded language used to criminalize Indigenous people, people who use drugs, and unhoused community members. Theme 1, transportation safety. Framed around policing and social disorder at transit stops, with no peer or Indigenous voices shaping safety plans, no acknowledgement of transit barriers Indigenous and marginalized people face, nor community-led solutions for real safety. And if you only measure safety by how quickly you can remove someone from a bench or sidewalk, what kind of safety are you really creating? Theme 2, crime prevention. Calls to expand CCTV ignore the fact that cameras don't save lives or build trust in Indigenous or marginalized communities. They only deepen mistrust and surveillance. Business safety and vacant property protection prioritize property over human dignity and housing rights. Graffiti enforcement criminalizes marginalized youth and their expression. What's more dangerous, spray paint on a wall, or a system that punishes expression while refusing to confront generational trauma? Theme 3, homelessness, addiction, and community impacts. Monitoring calls to first responders is a reactive enforcement tactic, not prevention or peer-led care. 2 proposed daytime drop-in hubs emphasize safety and security, risking the imposition of policing rather than embedding culturally safe, peer-led Indigenous self-determined support. Who decides what safety feels like in these spaces, and whose presence is considered a threat to it? Theme 4, health and wellness. Focus on urban beautification and commercial vitality, ignores trauma, substance use, harm reduction, and Indigenous wellness frameworks. Core needs in this crisis. What good is beautification if it comes at the cost of human lives? If the flowers bloom next to tents that are being swept away? Theme 5, advocacy. The committee's advocacy is reactive and constrained, pushing senior governments for more shelter beds and housing within bureaucratic limits. It reduces a public health and justice emergency to a budget problem, sidelining transformative, peer-led, Indigenous-driven systemic change. What if the problem isn't lack of money, but the refusal to invest in humanity? Theme 6, education. Education efforts reinforce policing, legitimacy, and conventional crime prevention instead of confronting systemic harm drivers or centering lived experience and Indigenous narratives. When education trains people to fear the poor and ignore the root causes, what are we really teaching? Now, I'm going to list the critical gaps and missed opportunities that I see in this work plan. There's no meaningful peer or Indigenous leadership in decision making or program design. Over-reliance on enforcement agencies dictates data, agendas, and outcomes, sidelining community expertise. Safety and security means policing, not healing. Advocacy is superficial, failing to demand Indigenous self-determination or systemic transformation. No recognition or support for transformative community-led cultural initiatives. Decisions rely on metrics, perpetuating criminalization instead of addressing root causes like poverty, colonization, and trauma. Final truth. This committee is an agent of harm, not safety. Under the guise of public safety, this committee enforces colonial and carceral logics that continue to harm Indigenous peoples and people who use drugs. Its enforcement-heavy strategies displace, traumatize, and erase peer and Indigenous leadership. Cultural safety is sidelined, replaced by surveillance and punishment. True public safety demands peer-led, Indigenous-governed models that center healing, harm reduction, housing, and transformative art as community care. Anything less is complicity and ongoing violence. The committee's tokenistic, budget-driven advocacy reduces human lives and community sovereignty to ledger entries, an abdication of responsibility that must be exposed and overturned. We deserve a system that listens, respects, and invests in those most impacted. Until this committee embraces that truth, it remains a machine of harm masquerading as safety. This isn't just a critique, it's a mirror. And if this reflection makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why. I'm Beverly, and this is Detoxing the Discourse.